Hi again, we're back in the kitchen. We're working again on learning some practical, easy knife skills that'll take your cooking to another level. I assure you it'll help you become more efficient and certainly more confident and happy while you're cooking in your kitchen. Last video we talked about types of knives we used. We talked about how it is important to stabilize your cutting surface on your counter before you begin cutting. We talked about 3 types of knives. You might remember the chef knife. We talked about a serrated knife or a bread knife. And we talked about the little teeny tiny paring knife. And they all pretty much have different uses. And I'd like to talk with you now about how to hold the knife safely, how to maintain the comfort and the stabilization of the knife when you're cutting the food. And that's really the secret to knife use, honestly. So let's go right into our chef's knife. So let's talk about the anatomy of a knife, which is an interesting concept, right? So this blade is sharp from tip to base. This is called the bezel of the knife. This is the handle. And when you're shopping for a knife, you'll see knives can vary a lot, depending on how they're made. Some are forged totally out of tough metal. Some are metal pieces that are inserted into plastic handles, like these 2 are. And my suggestion is, if you're gonna invest money in a knife, invest in a forged knife that is a full blade down through the handle that has rivets holding it in place, and it'll be the most stable knife. This one, over time, will probably separate from the handle. So I think in the long run, it's a little better to spend a little more upfront, but not necessary at all. Okay, so this is my chef's knife. This is the handle. And the most important thing when you're using a knife is to maintain your comfort, but also have it be stable and safe in your hand. And oftentimes I know people will take their knife and they'll go to the board and they'll be cutting like this. And this is really not the way you hold a knife, you guys. What I want you to learn to do is when you pick up the knife, I want you to put your hand right onto the blade. So I'd like you to have your thumb on one side and your index finger folded with your finger against the base of the blade here. So you're choked all the way up. And this is going to give you the most control of your knife. You're going to be able to really maintain control no matter what your food is doing on the board. So again, I want you to think about when you pick up the knife, you're not just shaking hands down here, right? I really want you to get to know the knife. So I want you to put your hand all the way up on the blade. And you might say, I don't want to put my fingers on the blade because I don't want to cut them. I assure you that if you just wrap your hand around the top of the knife, you're not going to be anywhere close enough to the blade to cause you any trauma from the blade. And you're going to have the most stable surface when you're cutting. Okay, so that's the chef knife. And again, when you're doing the serrated knife, you're going to hold it in the same way. So you're going to hold it again up here by the blade. The difference in the serrated knife and the chef's knife is that when we cut with it, we use a different motion. And we're going to get into that. So again, my chef knife. What do I use first? What do I cut with a chef knife? I cut hard items like onions and potatoes. You can cut apples. I could probably even prepare my garlic with that. I could even cut my citrus with it. So as you just heard me say, one knife is probably all you need. This is really the workhorse in the kitchen, but it's also nice to have these other 2 types of knives. So let me show you the secret about cutting an onion. Actually, maybe we should save the onion for another video of its own. And let's talk about the potato. So let's talk about cutting a potato with my chef knife. And I talked a lot about how to stabilize the board, how to hold the knife so it's stable. Now you want to make sure that when you're cutting a round edge piece of food, that it's stable, right? So you're not chasing it around. And what you want to do, just like you have your board stabilized, you want to cut a little teeny flat surface onto your round vegetable that'll give you stability on your board. And that's the best thing to think about when you are starting to cut or break down any kind of food. Make it the size that's safe to cut. Make it stable on your board, and you'll be much happier and safer and have a lot more confidence. So let's talk about how we would cut a potato. I'm going to grab my knife as I told you, not shaking hands with it, but getting to know it and having my hand wrapped all the way around the blade, right? Remembering that this blade is sharp from tip to base. When I'm chopping, I really think about using the bottom third or half of the knife. When I'm preparing the food to chop, and I don't know if that makes sense, but we'll talk about it a little, I can use the tip of the knife for that kind of thing, right? But I don't want to use this tip of the knife for doing my major cutting or my major chopping, if that makes sense, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, with my hand choked up, I'm going to put the tip of my knife on the board, and what I'm going to do is something we call a rock chop. And I'm going to turn this way so you can see it. The tip goes down on the board, and you rock the round edge of the knife through onto the board, and that's called a rock chop. And it's generally the most used cutting technique that we do when we're in the kitchen. So again, if I'm going to do my potato, I have my knife held in the safe, stable way. I'm going to put my tip down on the board, and I'm going to cut down through my potato. And now I have two stable flat surfaces to go ahead and cut. And again, I'm going to put my knife down, and I'm going to cut through my food. Okay? So again, remembering that the whole blade is sharp, this is your chopping center, and you want to use a rocking technique. The other thing you want to remember to do is when you're holding a piece of food is to be sure to keep your fingertips curled under. And you know, with the kids we say make spider fingers or bear claw. Whatever it is, that picture in your mind that's going to keep your fingertips away from the knife blade, that's what I want you to think of. Okay? So you use your non-cutting hand to direct the motion of the food. You use your dominant hand to use the knife. And again, a basic rock chop of this potato would be tip down. I have my fingertips away from the blade, curled under, and I just rock through it. Again, tip down, and you just rock through it, right? And depending on what you're cutting, what you're preparing, you'll cut through quick and easily through the potatoes, right? The other thing I remember when I was in culinary school, they said when you're thinking about chopping, think about making planks and cubes, because that's essentially everything we use when we're cutting things, right? So planks are what you would think of, right? Planks. But a plank is also kind of like a slice. Think of a half of a cabbage and you slice down through it. That's kind of a plank because it's a shred, right? So these are slices, or we call them bâtonnets. That's the fancy name. So those are planks. And to dice or mince, we use the same rocking technique. You notice I have my front of the blade down and I rock through it. And then I create little cubes. Let me do them a little bit bigger so you can see. I create a plank. I hold the food with my fingertips under, my tip of my knife down. I'm cutting with this part of the blade, and I cut down through it, and I cut down through it, and then these are my cubes, right? So these would be dice. And the smaller you make the dice, then we get to the word mince, and that's where all those words come from, right? So julienne is really a skinny plank. And again, once you get the feel for how to just tip down and glide through your food, the cutting becomes so easy. So that's really the chef's knife, and depending what you're cutting, that's all there is to it. Now, I like the serrated knife because the serrated knife will allow you to cut softer food without smashing it. So you think of the beautiful bread that you've just baked. You don't have to smash through it to cut it, right? And oftentimes with a chef's knife, that's what happens. But this, with these little teeth, will allow it to bite right in. I also like to use them on citrus fruit or tomatoes, where the skin is a little bit tougher, and sometimes even the chef knife will bounce off of it. Well, that's not really safe when it's bouncing off the food that you're cutting. So I would use this serrated knife in the same manner. Remember, we did tip down, and then I would cut down that way. Or remembering that these allow you to do a sawing motion, and it'll saw right down through and quickly through that skin, and that's not, the motion would not be the same. It's a little bit harder with your chef knife. So the teeth on this is what I like. And finally, let's talk about this guy a little bit. Now he's a peeler and a seeder and those kind of things. I like it for apples. You can actually separate cloves of garlic pretty easily with it, just by holding it like you held the other knives, and then just sticking it down in and separating the cloves. So it does that for you. It's really good to use with an apple. What you do is you put your thumb in this hole, and you can just run this knife around the side, and you can easily core out that apple. And then again, you hold the paring knife a little bit different than the other knife because you're actually holding it parallel. If you look at how I'm doing this, because you're running the blade through the skin of this apple. So it's really good at peeling, right? The other thing it can do for you, except if you have seedless fruit, I was going to say it'll pull the seeds out. You can use the tip to de-seed things. You can devein shrimp with these little gadgets, these little knives. They work as well. So just a few ideas, just a few examples of how we use our 3 knives. And there's much more to come. We'll talk about, again, the chef's knife, the serrated knife, and the little paring knife. So thank you for watching. When you tune in next time, I really want to show you how to cut an onion so your neighbors are going to say, oh my, how do you do that? So let's do that next.